Hello and you're welcome to the Big Tech Show with me, Adrian Weckler, in association with Square. Square can help with your business needs from menu management and online ordering to payments. Visit square.com for more. Now, a major new investigation casts further light on the use of Predator, a spyware application that can secretly take over the microphone or the camera on a targeted smartphone and turn it into a spying device. Well, I'm delighted to say that I'm joined on the Big Tech Show by the head of the security lab at Amnesty International, Donncha O'Cearbhaill. Donncha, you're very welcome to the podcast. Before we go into the investigation that you and some media partners have done and is now published, let's just go take a step back with the basics. What is Predator?
Hi, Adrian. Thanks for having me on the show. Predator is what we term a highly invasive spyware tool. And this is a tool developed by we call a mercenary spyware company called Intellexa, sold to governments around the world. So with a tool like Predator, a government can basically break into any phone, whether it's an iPhone or Android, just by sending the target a link.
A link. So that could be maybe a link to, for example, a bogus story, or what is a link?
Exactly. So like a web link. So we've seen people, for example, seen attackers sharing links over SMS message, WhatsApp, saying, here's a new article on the Irish Independent.
Yep.
Go and click this link to see the story, as a way of trying to trick the user and thinking it's something legitimate. And just by the user clicking on that link on their phone, opening in their browser, that can be enough within a few seconds for the spyware to be able to break into the phone, hack the device, and eventually get access to all of the personal and private information that's on that phone.
A few seconds. So we literally could be talking about a text message, because I get spam text messages all the time, about unpaid tolls or the revenue or whatever. In theory, it could look like that, or it could be an email. I tap on or click on to one of those, and within a few seconds, this spyware is running inside my system.
Exactly.
Okay. And I mentioned a camera and a microphone. Like, what is this set up to do? What's the worst that it can do?
So Predator is a surveillance software, and it's really designed to make the whole phone an open book to the person who's operating the spyware. So it can access all of your photos. It can turn on the microphone and record the room. It can access your camera. It can even access your Signal messages. So most people think Signal, what could this secure? But this can even break in and get all of the unencrypted messages before you even send them. And so it can access everything that the user could have on their device and more. It's really
This is astonishing. I mean, it goes against everything we're told. I mean, you mentioned Signal. I've interviewed Meredith, the CEO of Signal, last year. Very relatively secure messaging system. Apple keeps going on about how secure and encrypted their phones are. And yet we have a piece of software here that can bypass it all.
It's indeed very, very scary, and I don't think it's necessary to put the fault at the tech vendors. I think what's really at play here is that there's a huge and very profitable industry that's currently
to use it. Yeah, so let's talk about that for a second. So this is a piece of software which was developed a few years ago, ostensibly, I think, or on the face of it, they said, to help governments and states to fight terrorism, right? So very sophisticated, founded by an Israeli founder. What do we know about who is selling this now and who is buying it?
So as you say, the Intellexa company, or the Intellexa Alliance, who's selling this tool, was founded by Tal Dilian, a former Israeli intelligence officer who's now kind of gone into the commercial side of the business and trying to sell these tools to governments who maybe wouldn't have developed them before. So you can imagine with the Snowden revelations, you had the NSA building these kinds of surveillance tools in-house. But in the last 10 years, we've seen a whole market emerging of kind of for-profit players who build these incredibly advanced tools that cost millions and millions of euros, and then really sell it to anybody who can buy it.
Anybody who can buy it. So that could be a regime. It could be, I don't know, who else might be in the market for that?
So these companies say they sell it only to governments, and we've seen them selling to kind of many governments with a poor human rights record. Last year, we even saw it being sold to the RSF militia in Sudan, who I think some of you will have seen earlier in the year was involved in a coup attempt. And so you're seeing that it's really being sold to some of the most violent countries with a terrible rights record, and even to non-state actors for military purposes, and who knows how this data could be used.
We should also mention there is an Irish connection here, right? Because the company you mentioned, Intellexa, has an office about 100 yards from the Irish Independent in Talbot Street. Literally, if I walk around the corner from here, they have an office. Now, I've been trying to contact them, waiting outside the door for a while. There doesn't seem to be any way to contact them. Obviously, we'd be interested to hear what they said. We're not the only media organisation trying to contact them at the moment. It's one part of the report published by Amnesty, I think, looks at the issue of whether this is being regulated properly, right, in Ireland or in the European Union.
Exactly. I think some of your listeners may have seen the Pegasus project 2 years ago, which was showing the extent and abuse of an Israeli spyware company.
That was NSA, right?
With the NSO group.
Yeah,
exactly.
NSO, yeah.
And what we see now is, this problem hasn't been solved. Instead, we see a massive EU kind of multi-state organization, Intellexa, who's selling these tools from the EU, supposedly even marketing themselves as being EU-based and EU-regulated. And again, as we see today in the report, it's being used to target human rights defenders, target journalists, and even, as we show, it's being used to target EU institutions and senior EU politicians, including the President of the European Parliament.
Yeah, you gave an example. For example, I saw a tweet that you put up showing what purports to be a Twitter account, which is actually an attack vector for this spyware. And it is replying to the Twitter accounts of the European Commission and the President of the European Parliament, Roberta Metsola, with a link to what looks like the South China Post, which is the southchinapost.net, which I don't think is a correct link, an article. So if the European Commission Twitter account holder or the European Parliament President taps or clicks on that link, they then get infected. Is that right?
Yep, that could have been enough for them or their staff to get infected.
And I guess it's probably outside the remit of our expertise, maybe yours too, to wonder who would buy spyware-linked data associated with the European Commission or the President of the European Parliament. If this is a business exercise, a commercial exercise that's being done, and you've 50-page report today looking into this, like who's going to be buying that information, or who would want to buy that information legitimately?
So in the case of this particular campaign, we do believe it's the Predator system has been sold to a government and has been operated by somebody on behalf of that government. In this case, in our 50-page report, we were able to find a lot of supporting evidence to show links between this campaign we found on Twitter and Vietnam. We found a number of Vietnamese journalists being targeted through the investigation with media partners. We also found that there was contracts between Intellexa and the Vietnamese Ministry of Public Security. We've managed to find export records showing the spyware was shipped from Europe and from the UAE to Vietnam.
And it was a particular Vietnamese journalist, wasn't it?
Exactly. So,
and how did he know, or what were the warning signs to him, or subsequently to you and to Der Spiegel and the other media partners investigating this, to indicate that it's likely that he had been a victim of this?
So our team at Amnesty International at the Security Lab, our goal is to investigate surveillance, especially spyware attacks targeting civil society. We've seen over the last 5 years that more and more states are using these kinds of tools as a new weapon in their toolbox to silence critics and opponents, where previously they might have just jailed people or intimidated them physically. Now they're also using these kind of high-tech tools to harass people that oppose them. In this particular case, we have been tracking Intellexa for a number of years now. As part of that, we do technical investigations where we try to identify what servers and what domain names are being used to deliver the spyware to targets. From these kind of technical investigations, we first found the Twitter account sharing these links that we were able to identify as predator. And then from that, we started reaching out to various people we identified as targets, including the Vietnamese journalist based here in Berlin, Mr. Lee.
So you worked backwards. So was it a deduction process with the journalist in trying to piece together what he might have tapped or clicked upon from that analysis of those potentially infected links?
Exactly. So first we were tracking Intellexa, and then we found these links that were sent to the journalist, and from that we reached out to him, interviewed him, and with his consent, we performed a kind of detailed forensic analysis of his device to check if indeed he had clicked the links, and if he had clicked the links, was the spyware installed.
Do we have any sense at all? It's not covered in today's report, but do we have any sense about its use or misuse in Ireland at all? Has it surfaced in any way, or have there been any suspicious links that have surfaced in Ireland?
So as you mentioned, there is one clear link to Ireland. That's that two parent companies of Intellexa are hosted here, and records published by the Currency outlet show that there's tens of millions of euros of profit from sales of these spyware tools going through Ireland. There's very little transparency around, who owns the companies, about where exactly these monies come from, and how these sales are being regulated. There needs to be urgent action in Ireland as well as across the EU to first bring transparency around
that. Yeah, but we don't have any smoking gun yet as to, for example, someone targeting the account of Leo Varadkar or Micheál Martin or Mary Lou McDonald or anything like that.
We haven't seen any concrete cases of targeting Ireland. I think as this company, as industry continues to be able to sell these tools to states and to actors who use them kind of so chaotically, as in this case, I think it's only a matter of time before we see these being used.
Yeah. Gosh, it makes you wonder, isn't it? Maybe we're not worth it. Maybe what Leo or Micheál or Mary Lou are saying isn't actually worth it for anyone to buy that kind of data. So you're saying that the EU should be doing more to investigate this, to regulate this. I wonder what it is they might do.
So there has been a lot of discussions and investigations over the last 2 years in particular about what needs to be done here. There is following the Pegasus project, there was a committee of inquiry at the European Parliament, which over 2 years investigated how these kinds of spyware and surveillance tools have been misused outside the EU, but also in the EU to target civil society and political opposition. So our team at Amnesty and colleagues and community partners have found evidence that these tools are used by Hungary to target opposition media, in Poland to target the leaders of the political opposition before the previous European elections in 2019. We've seen the same tools being used in Spain to target Catalan protesters and political figures. And so now we're seeing, I think what's different is, again, now it's not just tools being bought into the EU, but it's tools actually being developed, exported and used by the EU. So I think there's a number of key points that need to be done. So one is that immediately the EU needs to cut all existing export licenses, which are allowing the sale of Intellexa tools outside the EU. I think we need drastically increased transparency around which states are using these tools and which companies are manufacturing such tools. And more pressingly, for particularly highly invasive spyware such as Predator, which has the ability to access all of the data on the phone and has no possibility of being technically audited or limited, Amnesty is calling for a full ban on this spyware.
Okay, I just should say again that we did try to contact Intellexa, but there just didn't seem to be any way to reach them. I did send some LinkedIn messages, so if they do come back to us, we will bring you that. Just to go back to a technical point, though, we sort of briefly mentioned it at the top of the podcast. I'm still slightly astonished that this is not dealt with on a device or an operating system level particularly by Apple and Google. I mean, Predator isn't new; it's been around for a few years. You know, most of us have written stories on it before, and it always seems to be associated with. Because I believe most of the sales, for example, are to the Middle East. I think there's only a couple of million euro in revenue and sales within Europe. Most of the sales go to the Irish office, according to their accounts, appear to be to the Middle East. And that maybe psychologically we kind of associate it with something that's going on, somewhere else. And it's not that they're targeting, Downing Street or the Elysee or Pennsylvania Avenue or even the Dáil. But it just amazes me that something as powerful and as sneaky as this can't be, clamped down upon by Apple or Google.
So I do think it's an ongoing battle between these spyware companies and the tech companies. If you look even in the last month, I think there's been 4 emergency updates for the Apple iPhone operating system.
Yeah.
Specifically to patch vulnerabilities used by spyware companies, including Intellexa as well as NSO Group. With a tool such as Predator, there's two kind of components that are key. So one is the spyware itself that gets installed on the phone, and then what's the kind of really tricky and complex part is what's called the exploit or the 0-day exploit.
Yeah.
This is the unknown code that can exploit some like hidden flaws and really complex issues and security issues in a phone like an iPhone or an Android phone, and through a chain of 3 or 4 of these that they can burrow into the device. So this is like extremely difficult to find, and if you have knowledge about how to break into this iPhone, it's worth 5 million or more on the market. And so if these companies are spending really millions to either develop these kinds of attacks or else to buy them from the market and then kind of productize them in the tool that they're selling to governments, who then can send a pointing link to infect whichever phones that they want.
Not that this should make it any less worrying or alarming, but I take it that the regular person on the street is very unlikely to see this turning up on their phone.
It's true. So from what we know about these tools, they're mostly or only sold to governments, and they're used for their priority targets. Even for each person that gets infected, it could cost 10 or 15,000 euro just to infect that device. So it's not something you're going to see happening to random people on the street in Ireland, but it is a risk for civil society in countries which are already oppressive, as we see in the case of the Vietnamese journalist in Berlin. It's a big threat for diaspora populations, and people who might have seeking asylum or seeking protection in Ireland could still be threatened by these kinds of tools. And as we continue to allow a proliferation of these tools, I think it's really hard to predict, where and in what context they might be used. And even having a small number of people can be very harmful for all of their communities, their connections, and put a lot of people at risk.
Lastly, just on a broader, more philosophical point, the existence of a tool like this, would Amnesty hold that it just shouldn't exist and shouldn't be used by governments, even when they are fighting terrorists?
So I think there's definitely a place for some technological tools and some surveillance tools to be used in a way that's kind of necessary and proportionate and compliant with human rights safeguards. Our view at Amnesty is that tools such as Predator or Pegasus, which are highly invasive and have no limitation on what they can access on the device, as well as there's no means of having accountability of where they're used or to regulate their use in ethical means, are too invasive for privacy, that they can never be human rights compliant. So highly invasive tools should be completely banned.
So maybe a more realistic, I'm just conscious of what's going on around the world at the moment, particularly this week, maybe a more realistic approach by states, if they say that they want these types of tools to maintain their own security, not to be outsourcing them to private companies on the market and incentivizing the kind of expansion of these tools that can create these kind of this multiplier effect.
I think that's one driver we see, is that when you have a company whose business model is selling these expensive surveillance tools, they have of course an incentive to keep selling them to more customers, and pushing the boundary of what's acceptable. And unless regulators and legislation is really keeping up with that, you can be in a situation like we've seen over the last few years where these tools are used out of control in a way that nobody can really predict. Like in this case, to having EU spyware being turned around to target EU institutions, politicians, and with a continued growth of these kinds of tools, it's very hard to predict where we'll end. That's why we're calling for this immediate regulation.
Okay, Donncha O'Cearbhaill, Head of Security Lab at Amnesty International. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thanks also to JJ Clark, who produced, to Gavin Hennessy on sound, and Niall McMonigal on video. From me, Adrian Weckler, you've been listening to or watching The Big Tech Show in association with Square. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.